Well, welcome everybody to this virtual reliving of the 1983 Boston Marathon, as we welcome one and all to this virtual year of COVID-19. Joining us today would be the podium finishers, Greg Meyer and Ron Tabb and Benji Durden. I'm Toni Reavis, longtime broadcaster of the marathon. And guys, it's good to see everybody. Where's everyone located? Benji, where are you?
I'm in Boulder, Colorado. We've lost
Greg?
Ron, it looks like.
Greg, where are you located now? You still in Grand Rapids?
Still in Grand Rapids, Tony, sitting in my office.
Good. Yeah, you're the one that was working hard and had to put this into your schedule, so thanks very much. And Ron, what part of Florida are you in right now?
We've lost him. He's off the...
He fell off the back.
Well, guys, it was...
There he is. He's
1983 was quite a year. As I recall, of course, Greg, you and I were living in Boston at the time and basically hanging out at the Bill Rogers running store in Cleveland Circle. I just lived 2 blocks down. We spent a lot of time together that year. That was back in the days also when you guys would race your way into marathons. And I was looking back at the records, and Benji, you ran 4 races on the way into Boston from the first of the year, and Greg, 7 times you raced. So everyone knew that you were in great shape. I think you were the favorite going in, although you didn't like that designation, as I recall. You wanted to be the underdog, but you were hot as a firecracker. Benji, you'd already run a marathon in Houston where you finished in 2nd place, and Ron DNF'd in that race. So going into 1983, what was your mentality? Benji, what was your mentality in that race? Were you aware that it was the qualifier for the World Championships in Helsinki, the first of those, or did that make a difference?
That was for me the primary reason to be there. I'd been invited to go to Rotterdam by IMG. They were trying to get many of us to not run Boston. They were trying to set up a final attempt for Billy to win Boston. But I wanted to run in the trials for the World Championships because I felt like that was a good team to make. When I got there, part of my mentality, I felt like I was not being respected. The Boston papers didn't pick me to be in the top 10. And I felt like I'd been running better than that. So I was there with a little bit of a chip on my shoulder.
That's not altogether a bad thing.
No, but sometimes you do foolish things because of it.
Greg, I was looking back at my old notebooks, of course, and here I'm going to show you guys. This is log number 2. This covered May 82 to May 83, one of now 250 of these log books I've kept. But Greg, you came into the year hot. You won the midnight run in New York City for Brooks, who you were representing at the time. You went down to the Orange Bowl 10K, where you battled with Alberto and Billy, taking 2nd place in a PR 28:12, just 10 seconds off of Alberto, when Alberto was just absolutely the king of the roads and the track. And your quote afterwards was, he got away from me at 5 miles, but you were coming back on him in the last mile, and you said afterwards, he's beatable. What'd you come out of that Orange Bowl 10K with psychologically?
I felt like I made a mistake at about 3.5 or 4 miles. I thought Al had hit a rough spot, and I just really didn't have the confidence to make a move to try to break away, because at the point he was Alberto and he was all everything. But I think you find out guys are human and you just move on. But it's one of those races where, and I think this is true of all athletes, you remember the mistakes you made almost more than the successes.
Yeah, but that was the time when you had this idea that when you moved to Boston in 1978, after the World Cross Countries, and started working at Billy's store and training with him, you were still, really doing it on the track. You were doing it on the roads. I remember at that Diet Pepsi race, you ran the American 28-24 over on Com Ave over the Newton Hills, and that was an American record. And all people wanted to know is, when are you going to run the marathon? You weren't being taken seriously until you got to the marathon when you lived in Boston.
Well, Tony, I'm going to jump off and re-sign on because my computer is not doing well right now.
All right, good enough. Benji, you came into that year. The first thing you did was run Houston in 2:12:20 on January 16th. And then like a month later, your Gasparilla, which Greg got 2nd at, you were 12th at. That's not much of a rest after a major marathon.
I raced a lot. Racing for me was a form of training when you get down to it. Houston, I'd won it the year before, so I was back to defend my title. And one of the mistakes I made was I kicked at 26 miles. I should have waited until we got around the corner and kicked there. Hailuebba caught me right at the line. Gasparilla was not my focus. My focus was Boston. It was a training effort. I probably could have run faster races if I had focused more on, half a dozen non-marathons and maybe 3 or so marathons, but that wasn't the approach I took.
And Ron, well, 1 year later, it worked out fine. It was that warm year, 1980, Bill's last victory at 2:12:11, and you ran 2:14:48. I think Marchetti, from Italy, was in second place.
Right. Yes.
Well, how was that? Dan? It was Kevin Ryan. I know was somebody who was living in town as well, working at New Balance, and Bill had his eye on him. But it was a warm day, and interestingly, he broke away in Wellesley, in front of a movie theater where the movie Breaking Away was playing.
That race, what I remember is training in Houston. I was still living and training in Houston at the time. And I felt like that with the heat and humidity there at Boston that year, that I came in with a little bit of an advantage.
Oh, so you played it right. So Boston could be anything, as we well know. In the 1976, the run for the hoses, 100 degrees. It could be, under 40 degrees with snow and headwinds. So it can be anything in Boston. Greg, your first chance at Boston was 1981. One of the, errors that people make in their first Boston is that the big downhill going into Newton Lower Falls from falling out of Wellesley before you start the 4 hills in Newton, you got away and had a lead. In fact, you held that lead just before you gave it up, I think just before the fire station. If you look back at that 1981 race, what were your memories?
I remember that my instincts were correct in going to the front, treating it like a race. What I realized really on the Brayburn Hill at 30K was probably didn't have the strength that I needed in order to do what my head was telling me to do. And that's when Seiko, Virgin, and Billy got away from me, was towards the top of Brayburn Hill. And it was just, my instincts were right, but my fitness wasn't there to cover it.
So then you come back 2 years later. Now, none of you guys ran Boston in 1982. You all had experience on the course. So now we come to 1983, and everyone seems to be in fine form going there. Greg, go into that, the fact that everyone was picking you. You won Cherry Blossom in a 46:13 American record. You'd run the week later, I think it was, the Colonial Relays in 27:53, which you called basically a tempo run. I remember we were both hanging out at Billy's store, and he had that locker room at back with the 2 showers, and I was in the back getting dressed to go for a run, and you were just coming out of the shower. And I remember saying to myself, God, look how fit that guy is. I feel like I could take a baseball bat to him and break the bat. I mean, was that as fit as you ever were?
It was. I mean, it was a stretch of a number of months, probably, going back to the summer before, where things were just going right, never injured. The training just built on top of itself. And I think living in Boston, training on the hills, training on the course, huge advantage. And then training with Billy, who had won so many times, you got a sense of your fitness level. And then obviously the races leading into it added some confidence. So everything worked out for a reason, and I think, I look back on things now, and while I ran a couple of good marathoners, I would never say that I was as good a marathoner as Benji, because he had a much longer career at it. It beat the hell out of me, and I just happened to get a couple of good ones in.
Ron, you were the one who was prolific. I mean, for those that don't know, Ron came out of Lexington, Missouri, went to Central Missouri State, where you were a 4-time All-American, but you pretty much got into the marathon business right away and started running a lot of marathons. But it wasn't until you hooked up with Bill Dellinger, the legendary coach, in '83, that things really sort of came to the peak for you. How important was getting Bill Dellinger to instruct you?
Well, Bill came into the scene in '83, just a couple of months prior to Boston. I had been self-coached since college in '77. And the reason I got into the marathon scene was because the assistant coach at Central Missouri had finished in the top 10 at the Olympic trials in 1976. And with the experience I had with training with him, it gave me confidence that I could qualify for the Olympic trials. And I always said that after college, I said, you know, you have the rest of your life to work in front of you, but to qualify for the Olympic trials would be something special that you would always remember. And so I made a goal of trying to qualify for the 80 Olympic trials. And I thought that I was best suited because I knew myself what I needed, and therefore I was coaching myself for the next 3 years. Then in 80, after the trials, I had some injury issues with plantar fasciitis, and I had both my feet operated on. And then at the beginning of 81, I started, after the surgeries, I started coaching myself again. And I ran Boston in 81 to see if I was going to be able to hold up again, because I'd had surgery on both feet. I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to continue with my running. Anyway, I ran as a test trial, I ran 222, 221, something like that at that Boston. And then a few weeks later went to Paris and ran 211, where I won that race. So,
right.
So that 81 Boston was pretty much a test to see if I could go. I had to wear training flats, but I wanted to see if I could go the distance again. And then I ran the 211 at Paris, so I knew I was going to be able to continue on and hopefully make the 84 Olympic team.
Well, when you take a look at your record in 1980, 2:13:35 in Houston in January. Mardi Gras, you won that in 2:11 flat. Then you got third at Boston and fourth at the Olympic trials. That's kind of a heavy marathon schedule, and probably learned your lesson there. But the Olympic trials is always going to be a one-off every 4 years.
Yeah, but the Olympic trials really didn't mean anything. There were a lot of notables that didn't run the trials that year. Among that, you know, Bill Rogers, Gary Bjorklund, Randy Thomas, you know, a bunch of the, you know, the top guys that were our peers didn't run that year because of the boycott. And likewise, I didn't take the trials too seriously. As I ran the Cleveland Revco the week before, had a nice little payday there, so that was the reason for that. And I just, you know, it was an interesting time. It was an interesting, you know, I felt like I had a successful career. I think I could have done more with had I had Bill Dillinger directing my training from the beginning. But you know, I decided that I needed a little bit of a change in '83, and that was when Bill took me under his wing and put me on the track, started doing more speed work, because I primarily was, I never hit the track. In the 6 years that I coached myself, I rarely went onto the track.
You know, it's interesting. Let me reintroduce everybody. We want to thank everyone who's joining us today to watch this conversation between the top three finishers at the 1983 Boston Marathon, Greg Meyer, Ron Tabb, and Benji Durden. I'm Toni Reavis. You know, let's get into the race itself in 1983. You know, I was looking back. It was the deepest darn field in the history of marathoning, as far as I can tell. Tommy Radcliffe had just gotten out of Brown University. Tommy, one of the well-known agents in the sport these days, and Tommy ran his debut marathon that year. He ran 2:19:51, and he got 83rd place. I mean, it was just, I mean, I don't think there were like 79 of them were the guys from the United States. I don't think there were 80 guys in America who broke 2:20 last year, and that was all in one race. There weren't as many joggers back then. There wasn't a bucket list item. The marathon was, even the slugs like myself, everyone went in to see how fast they could go. That was essentially the nature of the game back then. It was much more competitive. Do you agree with that? I mean, guys, does anyone have a different philosophy there, different theory?
No, I think if you couldn't run fast, you didn't run the marathon. I mean, some people would you know, consider it something to do, but for the most part, you ran it to be competitive. I mean, and if you couldn't run under 3 hours, you didn't consider yourself a real marathoner. Now I run around 4 hours, and I'm real happy about it. Things have changed.
So that was the nature of the game back then. I mean, 83 guys under 220. Greg, what kind of day was it? I mean, because it's Boston among all of the major marathons, it's purely luck of the draw. I remember the 2 times that Ingrid Christensen won the race, and she was probably in sub 220 shape, but the weather just didn't cooperate. I think she ran 224 both times. Even though she won the race, she was a little bit disappointed because the fitness that she had really didn't translate at the time. Now, we had just come off the Duel in the Sun back in 1982 with Berto and Dickie Beardsley in one of the classic Bostons ever. First time 2 guys won under 209, 2 Americans won under 209. And so almost like the stakes were raised. Was time a consideration that day when you woke up?
No. In all of the training that went on before Boston, with Bill Squires coaching and everything, the only discussion was about how to win, what you might need to do on the course, whether it was surge, the hills, how were you going to win? There was never a discussion about how fast to run. I do think during that era, though, there were more Americans who were hungry to race than there are now. I think we have some great athletes now, but we don't have the depth that we had back then. And I think people came into Boston that year, like Benji, like Ron, and others, all thinking they could win. And that thinking process leads to people running fast.
Who took it? Boston's one of those courses where if one guy who's among the top contenders goes, we all go. And if somehow it becomes hesitant early on, because that's a very steep first mile, and it's run as fast as 4:24. I think Ibrahim was saying in one of his winning years, went 4:24 for the first mile. But if it doesn't get out hard, then it has a tendency to develop into a hesitant race. Benji, who took it out that year? Because both Ron and Greg were well known within the running community for being hard chargers, but who took it out that year in '83?
Oh, the first few miles, I don't know that anybody really took it out. We had Rega Abraha in his Sony Walkman running. So he was kind of at the front because he wanted to have, that video of him running like that. And I found myself in the lead, I don't know, maybe 3-4 miles in. And we had a tailwind. And, I just kind of just eased along, and I was alone. So I guess in a sense, I took it out. I wasn't thinking in terms of, okay, I got to blast this race away and take it out. I just was running and felt good.
I kind of recall it a little different.
Okay.
I thought Abrahar Rega led till about 15 kilometers. In fact, I remember Benji saying to me, I think he had a 45-minute tape in his whatever contraption he had. I remember you, and I remember sort of giggling about that afterwards. I thought the pack.
I didn't remember where I found myself ahead, but that could well be. I was just, one of those things, you're on autopilot for so long, you don't really remember that many of the details.
Yeah. We were still, I think there was still a group leading into Wellesley. As I recall, once you hit halfway, you started to take off.
Yeah, Tom Fleming was in there. I think Ronig was in there. Danny Schlesinger was in there. It was a loaded.
Paul Cummings was in there.
Who's that?
Paul Cummings.
Paul Cummings was definitely right in there.
One of the late pictures is of Ron and, not Ron, Greg and I and Cummings.
Yep.
So, so it was, did you guys feel like you're running fast, or are you just running as the day, you got into a rhythm?
I felt like I was just in a rhythm. I was hearing things that suggested we were running fast. I knew we were going to have a quick time. I remember near the top of Heartbreak saying I felt like it was starting to rain. And I said to Greg, well, at least we're going to have a fast time, because I was not really looking forward to getting rained on. And then it didn't. We got kind of spit at. But yeah, we had the awareness that it was fast. That's not what we were trying to do. We were trying to beat each other.
Ron, where were you in the pack throughout the first half of the race?
Well, as you guys have already mentioned, I had a reputation for going out hard, and a lot of times that didn't pay off so well. So before I went to Boston, Bill said that he would take a baseball bat to my knees when I got back, if he saw me in the lead pack too soon. And I knew I was in really good shape when I went back there. We'd done some track sessions. I'd run a 5-mile tempo on the track by myself in sub 23. So I knew I was in really good shape. And, you know, so I knew it was a matter of just being in control, staying in control the entire way. And, you know, I'd have a good chance of finishing in the top 3, which was my objective when I got there. My splits for that race were pretty even, 104 and some change and 104 and some change. You know, so, you know, it was probably the smartest race that I ever ran. Well, without doubt, it's the smartest race I ever ran at Boston.
Well, you closed like a monster because you caught Benji deep into it. And I think I was reading that your last mile was sub 440.
Yeah.
It's the opposite of that 79 debacle.
Exactly. Again, it was, you know, being conservative. I don't know exactly how much faster I could have run had I been more aggressive. Maybe I would have blown up and not finished. And so, again, I took a more conservative approach. You never, I just recently, Bill sent me, Rogers, he sent me the tape of the 83 marathon. I'd never seen it before. And when you watch that tape, there was never a moment in there where I was in any of the video.
Where did you catch Ron? Or where did you catch Benji?
I caught
about 3 miles to go, I think.
Yeah. And, you know, we're talking, it's kind of funny because we talk about respect, and I had been, for the last couple of years, a lot of people know that I was focusing on someone else's running career and kind of putting mine on hold. After the Paris Marathon, I pretty much put my career on hold to coach Mary and train with her. So my career suffered as a result. That's one of the reasons I went to Bill to ask him to coach me. But I think Benji had made a comment to the Boston Globe to saying, Benji.
It was the Houston papers, not Boston papers.
Was okay, something to the effect of, you know, and this actually might have been Kirk Pfeffer, but someone made the comment that, you know, they didn't respect me because I was running too many races. And
no, I didn't say that. That wasn't me.
But I think that was Kirk Pfeffer, actually.
That was Pfeffer.
Yeah. So, but I felt like I really was back to, you know, trying to reestablish myself again as a good marathoner, and I knew the only way I could do that was to have a good race there. But by having a good race, I was going to have to be patient.
Greg, what were the crowds like that year? They're always phenomenal in Boston, but how much of a local did they take you for? Because you had already been in town for about 5 years.
I still think the crowd always looked for Billy. In fact, in the last 3 miles, I just assumed Billy might be the guy coming on me, not Ron, because I had such respect for him knowing the course. But the crowds were pretty darn good that day, as I recall. And I think Benji and Ron will both attest, they didn't have crowd control back then.
No.
So as we're coming down late in the race, especially after Cleveland Circle, when the press truck would go through and then you'd run through, it was like running through the belly of a snake. It would close in behind you. And I couldn't see who was coming. I couldn't see if anybody was there. And it was driving me crazy until some wingnut on the press truck said, relax, there's nobody coming. And I did, you know, because the whole goal was to win.
You would have been sub 209 if that hadn't been the case.
Well, it's funny how with 3 miles to go when he said that, it went from still running around 5 minutes a mile to 5:20 a mile. And it was like, I didn't feel any different, but you lose that concentration. You lose that fear that somebody's coming.
Yeah.
No, it's almost like Tour de France back in those days. I remember Will Cloney, the 40-year race director. Will used to say, Tony, if they don't want to be controlled, there's almost no way to control them. And then they put the snow fencing in, and that controlled them. But back then, I don't know. Some of the pictures from back then, the video from back then, was pretty darn exciting. They patch on the backside. I mean, it was like the Tour de France. They were right on you, and almost like if you're having a great race, you could ride that wave of enthusiasm. But if you're having a bad day, it's like just leave Vinnie Fleming said, just leave me alone. Just everyone get away. So, I mean, your emotions are just going through a roller coaster, aren't they?
They aren't and they aren't. I think when you're focused, when things are going well, my focus from 13 miles through 20 was Benji. So you really don't pay attention much to the crowd unless you hear that one voice, whether it's your coach or your spouse or a training partner, that you register their voice. Other than that, the crowd really didn't affect much of anything. It was, and I'm guessing Benji and Ron would say the same thing. You're focused on the people that you're trying to beat.
Yeah. I mean, I don't really remember much of the crowd. I know it was there, but, you know, Greg came by me. I was gathering to charge down the hill on the other side. You know, the race was going to be for me from 6 miles in. And I popped a very bad blood blister, and that was the end of the race for me.
Benji, were you aware, was the crowd telling you, was anyone telling you the size of your lead?
The press truck occasionally was telling me that I had a gap, but they, you know, I didn't know if I had a gap of, you know, 15 meters, 200 meters. I don't know. I just had a gap.
I think it was about 90 at its longest.
Yeah, but I didn't know. You know, I just never really knew. And I wasn't focused on that. I felt good. I was in a good rhythm, and throughout the race, even to the finish, I never felt like I was really that extended. I never felt that tired. It's just when I popped that blood blister, I couldn't run normal anymore because my foot hurt too bad, and I ended up tearing the plantar fascia. And that was sort of the swan song of my career, that race.
Ron, how far back were you when you started your charge? What, you know, what position you were in when you sort of put your head down and start going after the people in front of you?
I remember attacking Heartbreak Hill, and that's when I began making this, starting to pick bodies off, because I was probably in the top 20 at one point. And once I began the attack, and it was a conscious attack because I felt strong. I was gaining confidence that I was feeling good. And you kind of know if you're going to, you know, by that time, you usually know if you're going to have a good race or not. And again, you know, reiterating the basic goal that at least I had going in there was to make the world championship team and finish in the top 3. And, you know, it didn't matter, you know, if you finished first, second, or third. I mean, it did, but, you know, the first goal was to get in that top 3 position.
And when did you realize you were in the top 3?
Once we started, probably with about 6 miles to go, I felt pretty sure that, you know, that I had accomplished my goal. And then that's when I started really forcing the pace, forcing the SU. And
how far up did you think second place is in grasp, or did I could still win this thing?
Well, I'll be honest, I never saw Greg. You know, when he was ahead, you know, he had over a 30-second lead. So that's, you know, 200, well, not quite 200 meters, but, you know, I really couldn't see him because of the crowd. You just couldn't, you really couldn't see where.
You could, when you got to the final stretch, you could see it, but it was too late then.
Yeah, then you could, but, you know.
Because I could look up and see the clock at 2:07, and I think, oh, crap. It's a long ways to go.
Well, you know, I take a look at them, looking at Tom Derderian's great history book on the Boston Marathon, and at 20 miles, 1:37.11. That's 2:07.20 pace. And that's at the base. 20 miles is just past Center Street on the base of Heartbreak Hill.
Yeah, I think if I had not messed up my foot, I think Greg and I would have been low 2:08.
I think so too, Benji.
We would have pushed
Absolutely.
each other all the way to the end. I don't know which one of us would have won. It probably would have been Greg because with his better speed, but I do think we'd have pushed all the way to the finish and gotten down there. We might have even broke 2:08. We had that kind of day going.
I agree. That's one of the things I've always said, that I felt before going into Boston that I was capable of running in the 2:07s. And, you know, you have to catch the right day, you know, be in the right place at the right time, and the right, you know, everything has to go perfectly. But, you know, Benji, with your foot, when it blew up, you know, that was the end of your day, pretty much. And then Greg having you on to push
it was a bad pair of shoes.
he said, he's going 5:20 pace for the last 3 miles. Well, if he's running 5-minute pace, which he's more than capable of, that's a 2:08 flat, not a 2:09 flat.
Yeah. We were coming off a heartbreak for a little bit there. We were running in the mid 440s.
440, yeah.
I remember I was hosting the award ceremony afterwards, and one of the clients, I always tell this story of course, Billy was Billy. Of course, he was 35 years old at this point, and I was a little bit past his due date, you might say. But
past his prime, he still could run. He could still run.
No, of course. But if there had been a world championships in the 1970s, Bill would have been a 3 or 4-time world champion. But he never was. And so I knew that he really wanted to make that team. And so at the awards ceremony, Billy finished in 10th place that year. And at the award ceremony, as I was introducing the top 10, he was the first one I was introducing. And I said, well, Bill, I know you wanted to make the team and be in the top 3. How do you feel? And he twice did that pause as he always did, and then rubbed his chin as he always did. And he says, I feel 10th. Classic Bill. It was just classic Billy. Just like it's no excuses. It was what it was. I got 10th. I feel 10th. So, Greg, you went back home to Grand Rapids after that race. And then when you came back to town and we went out for a run one time, you said, I went back home and people were treating me differently because I'm now the Boston Marathon champion. And you said it in a way that felt that it was an odd feeling that you said people knew me better than anybody. And yet the fact that they had watched me on national television win the Boston Marathon somehow changed their perception of me. So how was that win? What did that mean when is in terms of how people then looked at you, both good and bad?
It's funny, and I think because Boston is such a media event, people recognize you for that. And and we've had this discussion. I don't think Boston was my best race of that spring, but it's the one that everybody knew. And it did change things. It dramatically changed everything from your shoe contract to how people treated you to, it was just a weirdness to it. Weirdness is the wrong word. There was a difference. And to this day, people remember. And I think, and no disrespect, because Benji and Ron have both won major events. There's something about winning Boston that just, for some reason, elevates you in other people's eyes. I mean, as an athlete, I know who's good, who's better, who's not. I give Ron and Benji all the credit in the world for the amount of marathons they did and did well. That wasn't me. But for some reason, Boston is Boston. And you get to hang that tag on you the rest of your life. Provides a lot of free meals and beers.
I remember John Cogway. He won both Boston and New York City. And I asked John Cogway from Kenya, a lovely man. And I asked John one time, what's the difference between winning New York and Boston? He says, back home, and he says, well, if you win New York, you hear your name on the radio for 3 days. If you win Boston, you hear your name on the radio for 7 days. So that was the distinction. Benji, how did you come away with that race other than with that blood blister? Did you feel like you maximized your fitness on that day?
I felt like everything was right. And like you always do when you feel like you're good, you've made a mistake, you can fix that mistake, and the next time you're going to run better. And I felt like, okay, I'm a 2:09 marathoner now. If I squeaked under 2:10, I'm going to get under 2:09. I never ran under 2:15 again. I didn't realize walking away from the race that I was damaged goods, and it took me a while to come to that conclusion. I was actually thinking I was going to be a factor in the World Championships, which wasn't the case. Ron actually had the best American performance for how many years was it before somebody ran faster than you, Ron?
24 years.
Yeah.
At championships. Yeah.
So that's one of the weird things about finishing a race. You have the elation of having a good time. You have the disappointment of not thinking, okay, I could have done better than this because I did this wrong or that wrong. And it's hindsight that really tells you what really happened.
You know,
Ron,
talking
did you feel? Go ahead, Ron.
we talk about Boston, and there are, when you look back and look back at your career, the one race that I really wanted to win. Same with our friend Tom Fleming. He always wanted to win Boston, and I looked at Boston as being the greatest marathon on the planet. And if there's anything I could do to change my career, it would be to win Boston. And so, Greg, you've got a trophy there that both.
Well, actually, he's got a clock.
Yeah, you guys got trophies. I got a
We got the
Seiko
trophies.
clock.
He got a clock.
God.
I'll trade you.
Hey, you know what? The clock is still running. I'm not.
Yeah. So, but but it's a great marathon. Benji, you talk about. I didn't realize that that was your after Boston, you never ran faster than 2:15 again, which kind of surprised me because I know you had a lot more in the tank than that. So.
Well, well, you know about plantar fascia. I didn't get surgery, which I should have done, but I couldn't run up on my toes again for like 3 years. Yeah. And you start changing how things work, and your life shifts and your focus shifts, and I was 32, so
yeah,
my
that's young though. I mean, look at Carlos.
Well, yeah, but
and it's a different day and age, but
it's how many miles you have in your legs, right? It's not how old you are. Billy didn't start really running seriously. He knocked off after getting out of college and was working, and only when his motorcycle got stolen, he had to run to work, and he ended up, then getting into the Boston Marathon. But he didn't start running seriously until like his mid-20s. So it's how many miles you got, hard miles you got in your legs, isn't it?
It's partially that. It's partially how many injuries you have. I think a little bit of it's psychological too. I don't think it's just strictly physical, how many miles you have in your legs. I think how many times can you go to the well? How many times can you make yourself believe this is something that's important enough to sacrifice for?
Is that why you never see open division guys become the great masters runners? Because it's how do you go out there and hurt yourself on the track sessions? No, you're not going to PR again. It's always guys who had to start a family or were injured, who then take 10 years off. Then they come on as masters, and now they're fresh psychologically.
All right.
That's probably true.
Hey, Tony, I do think the injuries play a big factor in it. Benji hurt his foot. I got injured shortly after Boston. And because you win Boston, or because you view yourself, or the shoe companies view you as a marathoner now, you jump right back on that merry-go-round to try to run the next marathon. And it just spirals with the injuries. And I think it's hard to recover. If I had it to do over again, I wouldn't have run Chicago that fall. I would have taken some time and gotten healthy again. And I think that's a mistake a lot of runners make is the marathon doesn't create talent, it destroys talent.
I can agree with that because 5 weeks after Boston, I went to Australia. I ran 2:10 there, won that race. Then went to the World Championships, ran 2:13, went to Beijing, won that race, then went to New York. That pretty much ended my career after that.
Well, guys, do you agree that, your whole life as you're coming up, you're reading about, the people who are your heroes and the stars, and you just can't wait for the race directors to give you an invitation. And so you've been waiting to say yes your whole life, and then it's hard to say no.
Well, especially since that's how we made our living. I mean, our contracts are okay, but we didn't have enough in our contracts generally just to live on. So we had to run races because that's where we made our income. And Boston didn't pay us to run, but if you had a good performance at Boston, you could parlay that into a good paycheck somewhere else. I mean, I'm sure that's why Greg ran Chicago, because, being the Boston champion, they wanted him and they would pay him to come and run Chicago. I ran Toronto that fall for the same reason. And that's where I finished the plantar fascia. I mean, it was a nagging niddly injury until I ran Toronto, and then it became a full-on tear.
The other thing I think too, Benji, and Tony mentioned this early on by the amount of races we ran going into Boston. We like to race.
Yeah.
We didn't train for the sake of training. We wanted to race. That's what we did.
If all we did was train, we would have quit.
Yeah. Or you'd get injured like these guys do. Now they train and train and train and never race.
Yeah.
You
They
think it
also
hurts the sport?
learn how to race. I think that was the other beauty of racing a lot. You learned how to race. You made mistakes, and you had enough races that making a mistake wasn't a tragedy. You could use that information in the next race and run smarter the next time.
You could follow you guys coming in. Nowadays, they sequester themselves for 3 months in these isolated training camps, and who knows what shape anyone's in until race day.
They
It's
don't
hard
even
for the
know.
fans. There's nothing for the fans to follow.
You hear that all the time now. Their training's been fabulous. It's been this, and then they're nowhere to be found race day.
Well, and part of the problem with that is you can do things in training that make you think you're ready. You can have a really great, I mean, my best example early in my career, I ran 6 times a mile at 4:27, and I couldn't break 31 minutes because what it was is that training session was a race. And I really raced that training session. And it took me a while to figure out, okay, training is not racing. Racing is racing. And you can tell yourself, okay, I can do this kind of workout. That means I can do this kind of race. And it doesn't work that way.
Greg, you know that Billy was especially like that. You go up to Tuesday night on the track at Boston College, and sometimes he'd just say, nah, I just don't feel it. Or he would just go through a 70-second lap and say, oh, geez, that's brutal. And you're saying you're a 4-time winner of the Boston Marathon. Billy was not he was a racer. He didn't put his money on his training. I mean, he trained hard, obviously, but he was a smart trainer. He saved himself for races.
Unbelievably smart and unbelievably intuitive as to what his body needed when he needed the rest. He had a gift for that, and I think that's what prolonged his career. But he also had a mind to race. I mean, he was the nicest guy in the world, and then he'll rip your heart out once the gun goes off.
Yep.
The lion and the lamb.
Hey, Greg, I have a question for you. Between the three of us, you had the greatest range from the mile to the marathon. Did you follow a set schedule, or did you, the way I would train, I ran how I felt. So if you mentioned that Bill, he'd go to the track and, some days he just didn't feel it. So did you have workouts like that where you just said, okay, I'm not going to do that workout because I don't feel it today? Or did you go with what Coach Squires was presenting to you?
Pretty much went with what Squires was presenting to us. There might have been 1 or 2 days in the whole year where something was going, you might have felt sick or something where you didn't do it, but it goes back to really beyond Squires to Warhurst at Michigan. Hills were part of my plan. So every Monday I was on hills doing repeats. And I did that all the way up until 3 weeks before Boston. You kind of stuck with the plan. But the other thing, and I think both you and Benji would agree with this, is when you get on a roll, there are no bad days. You're just cranking. You get into that zone. And quite honestly, from the fall before through Boston, I was kind of playing in that zone where I felt like I could do almost anything. The only 2 times I lost was to Di Castello when he set the world record at Gasparilla, and Alberto when he set the American record at Miami. So I felt like, if he asked me to do something, yeah, I can do that.
Guys, talk for a second. Ron, you pretty much trained on your own, but Benji, you famously with the Atlanta Track Club, and of course, Greg with the Greater Boston Track Club, and of course, we had the Chicago Track Club and Club Northwest, Colorado Track Club. The heyday of the American track clubs really was also the heyday of the American Ascension in the rankings. And now we're seeing a revival of that in clubs all over the country. How important was Benji, the Atlanta Track Club to you guys?
Well, initially it was how we got to races, because we'd go to races as a group. I remember going, we didn't have funding from the club really. We'd do things like, remember Braves baseball games, we'd go as a group and sell beer. So, pay for our travel. I ran with Atlanta Track Club members as part of my training. And it wasn't so much a big club training thing. It was like having 1 or 2 guys that you could depend on getting you through the runs. And I think that's important. I look at the stuff, we have a lot of teams right now in Boulder. 10-man, Jonesy's got a group, Lee Troop's got a group. And they're out there hammering all the time. And it's always the whole group. And I think there's a lot of domestiques in this situation where only one or two stars are going to make it. Where Atlanta Track Club, we didn't hammer all the time. We'd get away from each other except for the 2 or 3 runs we wanted to get the help. And we all ran well because of it, I think. So I do think clubs are important, but you got to have moderation too.
Greg, how about Greater Boston? I mean, there was that upper echelon, you and Billy and Haji and Randy and Dickie Mahoney, but there were a lot of domestiques around, but that mass also was helpful, at least at the beginning, having that big flywheel. I mean, there was only 3 or 4 guys that had finished the thing together, but having those big crowds at the beginning, especially up on the track, there was something about the atmosphere.
There was, I mean, when we went to do a track workout, it could be substantial, especially when Alberto would be back in town. I mean, you had Mikey Roach and Randy and Billy and everybody. It got violent. But, when I look back, obviously training with Billy, he was the best in the world for all those years. If you could run with Billy in training, it gave you confidence going into a race. But a guy that I always look at as someone who just helped me mentally along as a training partner, whether it was to hear me whine about something or to just keep me on the level, was Timmy Donovan.
Yeah.
218 at his best, but you know what? Best friend you could ever have in running. And I give him so much credit for just keeping me level.
Ron, how about yourself? Did you do most of your training by yourself, or did you have somebody to share it with?
Again, while I was coaching myself, I ran pretty much alone. And I didn't have a problem pushing myself. I could do a hour and 40 minutes for a 20-miler on my own. And I did that one year before one of my Boston races. It was when I got with Oregon, or with Bill Dillinger, and I started training with the Oregon guys, is when I made that big jump. The 83 obviously was my greatest year. And that was the first year that I actually had a group of folks to train with.
And did it dawn on you? Did you know it at the time? Oh, this does make a difference.
Oh, I remember the first workout. I was just with Bill last weekend. And I remember the first workout I did, first track session. And it was a 5-mile tempo on the run. I ran like 24:40. I finished in the top 10. I'm going, holy crap, this is crazy. At 7 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday morning, we're running 5 miles. It's cold and rainy, and we're breaking 25 minutes at 7 in the morning. I'm going, this will be good. This is what I needed.
Guys, as we take a look at the marathon world these days, of course, it's a whole nother world, and we don't always know what to believe about it. But what do you say to these times that they're running these days?
Sometimes it's really hard to believe some of the times they're running. I mean, thinking about the fact that we'd have been at our best almost 2 miles, actually at 2 miles behind. I mean, technology has changed. We know there are drugs in the sport. We don't know for a fact who's on drugs and who isn't. So you always have this hesitation when there's a great performance, and you think, well, was it real or was it Memorex? Is it fake or was it, and it has taken away from the joy of the sport for me to a degree. It also, we didn't run for time. We ran for race. We wanted to beat each other, and time was, yeah, that's great. We got a good time, but that wasn't our purpose. Now, Boston's not doing this, but most of the big races now, time is the critical element. Got like 10 guys that are out there breaking the wind. I mean, it's a different event. It's not what we were running. So that makes it also different. I don't know how to relate to that.
The race is what it was. The time is what it took.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
well, you're a journalist, Tony.
Yeah, that's why you do like the words. But yeah, we don't run as a group anymore races that are difficult. Was it Baltimore? Anyway, one of the courses, it had Cedar Hill, and I think it was Baltimore. It was a famous race. Nobody runs things like that anymore. It had this really ridiculous hill, and the times on it were brutal. But people did it because it was a famous race. Now you get a few things like Big Sur because it's scenic. People will run that, but in general, people look for the fastest courses.
Even before you guys' days, the second most famous marathon in America was probably Yonkers.
Yeah,
and it was notoriously difficult.
Yeah, and weather usually was a really brutal part of that one.
I think Johnny Kelly, the younger, won it like 7 times, but I don't think he ever broke 220.
Yeah, it was just that was part of the, was it 64 trial where you had to run Yonkers and 2 other
You had to
races?
run like 3, and then they would take a selection. It was kind of a mixed bag of how 68 was the first time they actually had an Olympic trial.
Yeah, we went out to the 68 reunion in 2018. That was great.
If I can jump in on sort of where the sport's at, I think it's absolutely offensive to improve your time by having propulsion in your shoes. It's one thing. I mean, they're using drugs. We know that. We fought against that back in our day with ERA, Benji, remember? We wanted drug testing out there. We wanted a clean sport.
Yeah.
And now I think, you're putting, jet fuel in your shoes. It was one thing to make your shoes lighter, but it wasn't propelling you. When you're getting 4% or 3% improvement, that's huge. I always believed, and Ron said this earlier, he always believed that he probably could have run 2.7. And I thought, had things gone perfectly on the day in Boston with you and I, Benji, and Ron right there too, we might have run low 2.8s, high 2.7s. So ego-wise, I have no problem thinking someone's going to run 2.04, 2.03, and maybe even faster than that. But the amount of guys doing this and the big jump in times with these shoes, it's not right. It diminishes.
It's confusing at best.
It's confusing, and it diminishes human achievement.
You know what it is? In some ways, guys, it's almost like in the steroid era of baseball. One of the great things about baseball, and track and field is the same way, you could compare 100 years ago with today because it was essentially the same thing. And then all of a sudden, the steroid era just completely eliminated the past in baseball. And now, I mean, Joshua Cheptegei, 12:35 and at 5,000 meters, don't walk in the park. I mean, not that he's not been on an ascension since he was a kid. He was out here at Carlsbad as an 18 and 19-year-old and ran that race and won it. This guy's he's like Daniel Coleman. This guy's a serious talent.
But the shoes he was wearing.
But the shoes are you talk about a kicker.
Yeah, I've seen speculation that it was as much as 10 seconds in that 5,000 for those shoes.
Nobody was coming within spitting distance of that 12:37 for a decade.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, you get under 12:50 and you're having a remarkable day. But,
yeah, well, things have changed. How about the status of American marathoning? Of course, we've just come through we go through these eras, and we just saw Dathan Ritzenheim retire, and Meb's out of the picture now, and Ryan Hall is lifting weights. You wouldn't even know that he was a marathon runner the way Ryan looks right now.
yeah.
But we got the next group of guys coming up right now. What are our hopes?
I think what's happening is what happened when I got going in the marathon. We're starting to see guys leaving the track because they're not able to be as competitive as they want to be. And they're moving back to the roads, or moving to the roads, not back, but moving to the roads. And so we're starting to see some depth simply because people are being forced to do it. I started off, there were so many guys in the 5,000 or actually then it was the 3 mile and the 6 mile, that unless you really were really fast, you didn't run the track because you had to, if you wanted to get any kind of feedback of positive nature, you ran the roads. And I think we're starting to see numbers again, which will help. I don't know how to compare them because, you look at the trials, the performances at the trials were just startling. And I think it had a little bit to do with the shoes. Because I think most of us that were prognosticating the race were thinking, okay, Atlanta course is pretty tough. A 2:11 is going to be a good day.
Yeah.
There were a whole bunch of people in that ballpark. So, but yeah, I think we're in a good place right now for American marathoning.
I think one of the things that we discussed earlier is the fact that we really didn't dodge. We were very competitive. We looked for competition. And, I don't think that era, that period of time where we were running in the 70s and the 80s, that we ever dodged anyone. I know that, we went out there, Benji, you were a front runner as well, we'd go out there and, we'd always mix it up. We weren't afraid to mix it up with other people.
That's how we won.
I remember a famous quote Alberto had one time. But he was, of course, the college roommate of Rudy Chapa. Rudy was a NCAA champion, a great runner, still the high school record holder at 10,000 meters. But Alberto said, we used to wake up every morning and go out to train to try to be the best in the world, where that was at least a somewhat realistic expectation. And now it seems like the gap between the best in the world and somebody getting up at the collegiate level has been broken. And the mentality of going out to really, really train hard to be the best in the world is no longer there. Do you agree with that? And how important that mentality of knowing, if I work this hard, I can be the best?
I think we condition the athletes now. I think we have as much talent now as ever. I mean, probably more talent coming up through the colleges. But I think the system is rigged against them. Whether it's college, high school now, they don't have dual meets. They don't have head-to-head competition. They have a series of time trials to qualify for nationals, and then they have one good race. And that's it. And I think more and more, when you look at how these guys train, they don't race. So how do they know how good they are? They can't tell by judging their workouts, you know, and I remember having a conversation with Warhurst about this. I got tired of hearing about the great workouts the guys were having when they couldn't race for crap. I think we need to learn how to race again. And I think when they do, guys will come closer. I do think, though, drug testing and other things like that will even the playing field, where there's really...
It has started. The playing field has started. I mean, that's why the 5,000 has been stagnant. Is drug testing is basically 1250 to 13 flat is the range of the top guys now. It used to be, you know, sub 1250 was just a typical day, and a lot of them can't do that anymore. That 5,000 has always sort of been my rule of thumb. Okay, how good is the drug testing? Because those guys get tested. The marathoners can get away with it because they only run 2 or 3 times a year at the most, maybe even just once. And so you got to find them. You got to test them off season, or, you know, just in the training. And you can't really ever catch them all. They're out there hiding. Ethiopia, you can't test anybody. You show up in the country to test and they all disappear.
Yeah. Well, guys, we've been at this about an hour now, and I think we'll wrap things up. As always, it's great talking to each of you, all of you, to go back and remember those glory days. 1983, one of the great classic Boston marathons, where Greg and Ron and Benji all broke 2:10 and led the deepest field in the history of the race. So, guys, thanks for joining us. Stay safe, stay well, and here's to Boston 2021.